Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Great. We're going to get started. We have an exciting seminar today. Welcome to our Ocean Studies Monday afternoon seminar. I want to open it up first to ask if there are any announcements. Yes. Your microphone is not working. Oh, I just asked if they could hear me, and they said yes. How about now? Okay, I'm just saying welcome to Ocean Studies Seminar. We have a great speaker today. I would like to welcome Daniel Vitalis. He is a registered Maine guide. He's also the host of the Wild Fed show on the Outdoor Channel and entering his third season. He's an entrepreneur with a company called Surf Thrival for supplements. And he has lectured all over the US and Canada for the last 17 years. And I think you'll all be really excited to hear what he has to say about diet and ecology today. So with that, please welcome Daniel Vitalis.
Thank you, Stephen. I was told that your attendance was only going to count today if you were very responsive. So we'll start with, how's everybody doing today? Good. Happy Halloween. Wait, happy Halloween. Pretty spooky, right? Very spooky. So I'm guessing because it's an academic setting that it can get a little dry sometimes in here. Is that true? Put your raincoats on. I'm anything but dry. I'm going to try to make this fun. I really appreciate your time today. As he mentioned, we're going to talk about ecological literacy, but from the perspective of a hunter-gatherer, because I spend a lot of my time hunting and gathering. And I feel like a little uncomfortable sometimes to call myself a hunter-gatherer, but when you hunt and gather, it's like kind of stuck with that title. This is my TV show, Wild Fed. We're on Outdoor Channel. We are in our third season, and we make about half of our episodes up here in Maine, so we do get to go all around the country, which is a lot of fun, but we do a lot here in Maine too, so you may see things that are familiar if you're ever able to catch the show. And our mission statement is reconnecting people with wildness through food. And we're going to really dive into that today. I want to teach you a few things that took me a couple decades to really understand. Who eats every day? Can I see a show of hands? So there's some things about food that I'm going to share with you that are going to seem so obvious. Have you ever had something like didn't seem obvious till someone said it to you, and then after it's like a no-brainer? It's like, oh yeah, that's so obvious. I'm going to show you a couple things about food that you may or may not know, but after today, you're never going to forget. They're going to make a lot of sense. This is my supplement line, Surf Thrival. So for about 15 years, I've been an entrepreneur as well. And preparing a lecture for you guys, I thought a lot about my own career, like the arc of my career, because I imagine a lot of you are thinking now about your careers and what they're going to be. And I thought a lot about how did I get to what I'm doing now. And I realized like I started with one question. And I'm like a word geek, and I think the word question is really neat and deserves a second look. Because sometimes we don't see things till we look again. And it's like, oh, it kind of tells you something, what a question actually is. It can be the beginning of a quest. And my first question was this. I didn't frame it this well in the beginning. What's our zoological diet? But I was sitting on a hill of grass eating a ripe mango. Anybody like mangoes? Sitting there eating a ripe mango, looking down at the supermarket that I got it at. And I started asking myself, because it's so delicious, like running down my face, at that time, my very clean-shaven face. It's running down my face, and I'm thinking, this has got to be food for people. And I started thinking, well, what is the diet of people? Is anybody who's doing marine biology work here? And you could look up any species, and it doesn't take you, just go to the Wikipedia. It's like, what does a cod eat? And there's the diet section. It's all broken down nice and neat. Very, right? What does a koala bear eat? It's like eucalyptus leaves. This is easy stuff. What do people eat? Well, now it gets real confusing, and it really depends who you ask. Who's heard that you should only eat plant foods? Hear that every day. I was a vegan for 10 years. Hear that all the time. Who knows anybody doing the carnivore diet? It's like, wait a second. Somebody's got to be wrong. Right? It can't be both. Why can't I go to Wikipedia and just look at a human diet? We've actually, as a species, we forgot what we eat. We're kind of in a little bit of trouble on this right now. And we all know, so I grew up in the 80s, 90s. That was like the human diet at the time. I grew up on hyper-processed food. Some of you might not appreciate the food renaissance you're living in right now. Does anybody remember the food desert of the 80s and 90s? There was like nothing good to eat. There was no farm to table like we have today. And there were health food stores. They were like the size of that bathroom at the top of the stairs. They sold oats and dates, and they smelled really funny. But we did not. I watched that evolution right up to the Whole Foods kind of world. I was in a Whole Foods recently, so frustrated by all like the glitz and the lights and the glam. I look at my buddy, I go, this is what we worked so hard to create. Like fighting for this organic food culture, but it's here now. So it's easy to forget that we've come through this food desert. When I first started asking myself what was human food, I thought for sure I would find it like in the supermarket setting, particularly like maybe in the produce section or the meat aisle. Like that made sense to me. These are whole foods. I can see they came off plants. Or I can see they're like parts of animals, so they must be at least natural foods. But I want to talk about first today what artificial foods are, because I think almost everything we eat, almost everything, not everything, and for some of you particularly, not everything, but almost everything we eat is artificial. It's not a value judgment, so I don't mean artificial bad, like sometimes we slip into that, like black and white thinking, like it's artificial, therefore it's bad. It's like not necessarily, but it's still artificial, and I'm going to show you how. So think about the word art. Art, artificial, artifact. That root word art, it's like when we take the symbolic, through some form of media, we take the symbolic and we represent it somehow. The human will or human consciousness, human ideas, human experience, and we represent it. That's art. What's an artifact? An artifact is something that's been shaped by human hands and human will. So think about this is a piece of chert. It's just a rock picked up off the ground. Is that an artifact? No. But what if I take that exact rock and I chip it into an arrowhead? Is that an artifact? Is that an artifact? Yes. So it's been shaped by human will. But think about the piece of chert. Inside of that, let's say the arrowhead's inside there right now. Once it's an arrowhead, it's got the same atomic composition. It's got the same molecular structure. Nothing's changed except that it bears the mark of human will. It's the same stone. That makes sense to everybody? Does it make sense to everybody? Yes. I know you want those attendance points. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes. Thank you. So we change it, it becomes an artifact. To explain how foods are artificial, we also not only need to understand what an artificial means, but we need to know what food is. This seems like it would be a really simple question, but I spent years thinking about like what is food? And here's what I've arrived at. My simplest definition, food is body parts. Meditate on this over the coming weeks. Food is body parts. Imagine if one of you could crack the code on how to create a synthetic calorie. How valuable of a discovery that would be? You got almost 8 billion people needing calories every day. What are they made out of? Where do they get those calories? Body parts. Living things. There's not really a way around it. If you take your plate and you just sort of pick it apart, you're like, okay, well, there's some legs on there, body parts. And I see the photosynthetic leaves of something from the Lactuca genus, right? Some lettuce leaves, so that's a body part. And then looks like those modified tubers from a potato is a body part. Let's not be kingdomists, right? Because sometimes we're kingdomists, where we think like body parts would be animals. We almost can forget that like fungi and algae and plants, like they have bodies and body parts too. I see the fruits of a lemon there, so everybody see how that's all body parts? A transverse section of a salmon there, the young, tender, meristematic shoots of asparagus, those tomato fruits, those are all body parts. And again, it's like, okay, we have the hamstrings of a cow, How about the cream there? That's interesting. That's a liquid tissue. Dairy's a liquid tissue, like blood's a liquid tissue. That's a body part. And then, of course, those sexual reproductive organs of a fungi there, right? So that's a body part. We eat body parts. So food is body parts. Think about when you eat like fermented food, like a kombucha or a sauerkraut or a kimchi. You're eating kind of like a whole civilization of body parts, because there are hundreds of thousands of organisms, all microbiota living in there, and you come in like Godzilla and eat a whole civilization of organisms that have created what's called a symbiote. It's the prebiotic of the cabbage and then the probiotic organisms, and they get together and they create this symbiotic thing that is the sauerkraut or the cabbage. We eat that. We're eating lots of body parts. But to really understand our food now, we have to understand something I think is much more interesting, which is domestication. You've all heard the word, right? Everybody knows a dog or a cat? Couple. But domestication's got another name. It's artificial selection. Because the things we domesticate are changed, like the piece of chert is changed when it becomes the arrowhead, and that makes it an artifact. Your dog, your cat, they're biological artifacts because they've been changed from what they were in the wild by human will and human hands. So if you think about a dog, this is interesting. Both of those dogs are the same species. When I was younger, I thought, oh, there must be like 500 species of dogs. I was like ecologically and biologically ignorant at the time. I didn't realize, oh, sort of like people. People come in a lot of shapes, a lot of colors. We're all the same species. Right? We can all breed together. We're the same species, Homo sapiens. Dogs are Canis lupus, here's the artifact part, familiaris. So does anybody know, what does the dog come from? Like, where do dogs come from? Somebody say it loud. Wolves. Right, they don't come from coyotes, or they don't come from African wild dogs. They come from one animal, Canis lupus, the gray wolf. So that is the origin of all dogs. Think about the goofiest small dog you know. And it's like, that's Grandpa. That's pretty wild. This animal lives outside. You know the days when it's like minus 20 in Maine, and they're living through conditions like that all through the whole winter outside. Think about what would happen to your dog. Does anybody have a dog that you would absolutely not leave outside when it's minus 20? But these dogs do just fine. Think about what you feed your dog, and then think about what a wolf does in order to eat. I know it's a little graphic, but it's also just kind of reality, right? So that's the wild animal, Canis lupus. You guys all know about binomial naming, right? That's that Linnaean way of naming things with Latin. So the binomial Canis lupus, well, when we domesticate, we get a trinomial Canis lupus familiaris, the dog, the wolf that we're familiar with. That makes sense to everyone? Yeah. Now, the wolf not only controls its own diet, it controls its own breeding partners. That's pretty key. And it's not like every wolf breeds, but the pack and the way the pack's organized determines who breeds and determines the future naturally. So we have natural selection at work. That's the environment, essentially, putting pressure on wolves. And then what's the other big selection factor? It's sexual selection. Sexual selection, which is how you end up with like a peacock. Or it's how you end up with deer with massive racks of antlers, right? That's essentially females determining how the species will, what direction the species will go. Sexual selection. So natural selection and sexual selection. But we've added something else in. It's artificial selection. What we have to do is essentially pull a wolf out of its natural environment. How do we do that? What's probably the means? What's the lever that you'd press to get a wolf out of its natural environment? It's food, right? That's probably how that happened. There's been in the last 2 decades, I'd say, particularly in the last decade, a lot of speculation about how this happened. But for sure, food was part of it. Either wolves coming to people or people taking a wolf pup and feeding it. But if you can draw an animal away from its natural food towards your food, you can eventually also control its sexual partners. So instead of sexual selection being the sort of pressure that's put on the genome, it becomes our decision making. Like, well, that one's got the right leg shape for going down a hole, and that one does too. Let's breed them. We'll get one that's even like more fit for that, and eventually you have a dachshund that you can send down a rat hole. Does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So controlling the breeding, eventually you can yield an animal that can no longer eat its natural diet, that's no longer capable of living in the wild. Those are the kind of changes that we can do artificially. So you can see that that is like an arrowhead chipped out of a piece of chert, but the piece of chert is the gray wolf, and the arrowhead is, I don't know what that's called, but hairless, some kind of hairless Mohawk dog. And what we end up with is domestication. Does anybody know what the Latin for domestication means? So like domesticus, the Latin is belonging to the household, belonging to the house. And so when we talk about things being domesticated, we mean that they are of our household or close to our household. There's an obvious metaphor here for us as well, but I'll let you dig into that on your own time. So the dog is domesticated, he's of the house. Over time, and it doesn't take that long, there's a really cool experiment that took place in Russia with silver foxes. Has anyone seen that? Some of you guys know about it. They essentially were breeding silver foxes for, I believe, for the fur industry, and they started to separate them out. Like, what if we take the foxes that are the most comfortable around people, like you go in to feed them and they respond positively. What if we just breed them together? And then we take the foxes that snap at people as a proclivity and we breed them together. And over time, it didn't take that long, they ended up with two lines, one that's hyper-aggressive and one that now is being sold as pets. So you might think, well, how long does this take? Because the genetic evidence and the archaeological evidence on how long we've had dogs don't necessarily correlate well. Somewhere in the last 100,000 years, but probably 15,000 years. And really in the last few hundred years, we started to develop out all the dogs we have today. And over time, what's really wild is that animal slowly can become that animal. Really, really interesting stuff going on in our homes. So what I'm kind of putting out to you guys is that we've been eating as a diet biological artifacts. I'll show you how this works botanically. But of course, this happens fungally and phycologically? Phycologically? Call on a resident phycologist here. So anybody know this plant? Trick question, because you do, but I'm going to show you how. It's going to take a second. This plant is called Brassica oleracea, and it's native to the UK. I'll show you a close-up of the flowers and call it out if you think you know what this gets turned into. What do you say? Now here's what's neat. Imagine you go to the supermarket and you're going to get a whole bunch of produce because you think, I want to eat a more varied diet. Who's heard it's good to eat a varied diet? Hunter-gatherers, so that's us when we're the wolf. Hunter-gatherers living their traditional lifestyle, it's regional. It depends where you live. If you're from the Arctic, you're going to have fewer species represented in your diet. If you live near the equator, you're going to have more. But let's say the average hunter-gatherer eats something like 200 to 800 species a year. Wow. Because Americans eat like 30 species in a year. And there is a developing field, it's called nutrigenomics, and it looks at the impact of genomes that you eat on your own genome. And what we find out in particular is that plant genomes, it's actually RNA from plants, influences our own gene expression. So it might be that it's more than just people always want to what vitamins are in there, Daniel? What minerals are in there? It's like, it's more than that. This is a living creature we're talking about. It's got its own agenda and its own genome, and there might be some interface that happens when we consume it. That's fascinating. So hey, maybe I want to eat a whole bunch of different species so I get all that variability. So I go to the supermarket and I buy a whole bunch of different things. So I go and I buy some broccoli. Broccoli is the inflorescence, the flower of Brassica oleracea that's been mutated through selective breeding to produce those tightly clustered flowers. Very different than how it would look in nature. And not defensible. Think about how when you have Anybody ever plant anything like a garden? You notice how how much work you have to do to keep that garden from being eaten down by herbivorous insects, or maybe mammals that want to come through, or birds come through. Before you know it, you're fencing it, you're putting poison around it, you're out there at night keeping the raccoons out of it. It's all this work. Why? Because the dandelion gets out in your yard and you can't get rid of it. The dandelion's a wild plant that produces its own defenses. So it is keen to the kind of things that happen in its environment. It protects itself with bitter compounds that are hard to eat in quantity, and medicines that in small amounts are valuable to you, but in large amounts would make you feel oh so sick. But we breed all that stuff out of our plants. The bitterness, who likes the taste of bitter? Like the coffee drinkers, for sure do. Developing a taste for bitter, like a bitter tooth. We always talk about a sweet tooth. If you can develop a bitter tooth, I think you can improve your health a little bit, because those bitter flavors are indicative of medicinal properties in most cases, but we've bred the medicine out of our food. So when Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, well, that gets hard when you've bred all the medicine out of food. So you end up with foods like broccoli, which look really cool and have a lot of food value, but no medicine left in them. And when you grow them, everything wants to eat them because everything's used to eating bitter stuff that they don't really like, and suddenly they found something with no bitterness in it. That make sense, everyone? Yeah. Okay, that was a tangential, because what I want to say is this plant, what's that called? That's also Brassica oleracea, with essentially a pigmentless flower that's been selectively bred to appear differently, but it's the same plant. So you go and you're like, oh, I'll get a broccoli tonight. Tomorrow we eat a cauliflower, so much diversity in my diet. And then you find out it's the same plant. It's the same genome. That's a Romanesco. That's also the same plant. And that's kind of cool, because you see that beneath the code of a plant's phenotype expression, there's math. See the fractal there? It's a mathematical it's a fractal in geometry. Anyway, that's also tangential. Rapini, same plant. Kale, same plant. Collard greens, same plant. All the cabbages, same plant. But wait, there's more. Brussels sprouts, guess what plant? Brassica oleracea. Even kohlrabi, same plant. When you go into the supermarket, it's like it's all a whole bunch of dog breeds. And you're like, oh, a lot of variety. I'll have a dachshund today, and I'll have a German shepherd tomorrow, and we'll get the pug for the next day. And it's like, oh, it's all the same animal. And that's what we're doing with our diet. It looks like a whole bunch of foods in your supermarket. It's like 5. Surprise. And it gets weirder with some of our fruits. Like, for instance, that's a wild banana. Can you guys see the seeds in there? Who's ever had a banana with actual seeds in it? You have? Yeah. For real? Yeah. Where? Please. Oh, I like it. I'll take that. You're the first. A real wild banana, of course, what's a fruit? Right? A fruit's a vehicle for the seed. It's there to procreate. So why would it have no seeds? Well, because it's a hybrid. The bananas we eat are a hybrid. That yellow banana that you've eaten, genetically, every single Cavendish banana you've ever had has been the same banana. They're clones. You know that? That every banana you've eaten is a clone of every banana you've eaten? Growing up, I remember there was this controversy about Dolly the sheep. They were going to start to clone sheep, and there was so much resistance from the public. Like, I will never eat cloned meat. What is this? Dystopia? Meanwhile, every banana that I've ever eaten is the same banana. A lot of you probably heard the Cavendish banana might be on its way out because finally there's breakthrough diseases that there's just not a deep enough genetic pool for there to be resistance. They're going to have to bring in there's hundreds of varieties of bananas, by the way. Anybody been to a place where you get to see, like, maybe you've been to Hawaii or South America, you start to see, like, oh, how boring my life has been. There's all these bananas. Some of them are hairy. Some of them are red. Like, who knew? But this one in particular was found in Jamaica in the, I want to say the 1700s, 1800s. Hold on, I got to know for you. 1836. Discovered, but before that, most bananas were cooked because they're so starchy. You ever eat an unripe banana in your teeth? You got all that starch all over your teeth? It's like an unpleasant feeling. We'd cook bananas. But this one was found to be sweet and edible in its raw state. Since then, that has been the only banana. And it's no different with our apples. Somebody shout out an apple variety that's common. Honeycrisp. Every Honeycrisp is the same Honeycrisp. It's all cloned. Every whatever one you want to pick. I like Cortlands and Macintoshes when they're in season, but they're all clones. And one of the neat things about an apple is they have something called extreme heterozygosity. Extreme heterozygosity. Fun to say. More interesting concept. What it means is that every seed in an apple will produce some new apple that will be different than the apple that it came from. So you can't just take the seed out of a Gala or a Red Delicious and get a Red Delicious. Instead, you graft it, you clone it. And so eventually you clone enough of them that you sell those, and then you create a market around it. We've been eating clones. Some of our foods have actually been straight up sterile. It gets even weirder with the grasses. Who likes to eat grasses? Because we all live basically on the seeds of grasses. What do we call those? Grains, right? Anybody want to take a guess at what that became? Corn, right? So that's teosinte from Mexico. And over time, you see those little silks on the side, how there's a silk associated with each one of those grains? Over time, the people of Mesoamerica turned that into hundreds and hundreds of varieties of corn, of maize. Corn, by the way, is like a generic European word for grain. So you could kind of call any grain a corn. And that's become the name for maize, but traditionally we call it maize. Well, over time, boy, have we downbred this thing. And at this point, most of the corn, outside of popcorn, you're still safe on the popcorn level, but all the corn we're eating, 96% of it is genetically modified corn. And it's been genetically modified to be able to put more pesticide on it. Essentially what was discovered was behind Monsanto, they had like a pond, and eventually some algae was growing in that pond. And this is like all the runoff from the glyphosate. They're like, how's anything surviving this? And the first thing they thought was, well, let's put the genome into other things. And then we can spray more glyphosate. So that gets broken down into all of these other foods. Like that. By the way, that's probably the most detrimental thing you can eat is vegetable oils, polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which is in everything. We fry everything in it, but it's not a really good food. The other thing we do with it is create stuff like this. And I want you to remember that when we eat stuff like this is essentially what we're eating. It's kibble for domesticated humans. I'm kind of joking, and I'm kind of being provocative, but I'm also kind of being serious. Because like our dogs, we're domesticated, we're of the house, and we eat something like they eat. Slightly higher grade of processing. I want to show you kind of something similar, but we'll look at animals next, the animals in our food supply. I wish I could show you the animal that becomes the modern-day cow, but the last one died in Poland in 1627. Does anyone know what that animal's called? The aurochs. They're mostly skulls in museums at this point and paintings on cave walls. But I'll show you another animal in the genus just to give you a sense, because we're so used to the lumbering cow that is left over, the artifact struck off of the wild animal. But this is the gaur. That kind of give you a sense. Some of us are descended from aurochs hunters. And you imagine getting up on the side of one of those and just trying to pop a little spear in there that you chipped out of a piece of stone. It's impressive to me. That's just a cousin species. But that eventually becomes that. That's fascinating. By the way, piebalding, which is white patches like that, are a sign of domestication. That's cool right there, right? So that is the Asian mouflon. And over time, we bred this animal into that animal. We're eating artifacts. It's fascinating. The ibex, today represented in our diet as the goat. One that I just love, Sus scrofa, the wild hog. An incredible animal. Incredible animal. But eventually becomes that animal. You just slaughtered a pig?
Yeah. Pork chop.
Yeah. These pigs are hard to make bacon out of. I'll say that from experience. I've been able to get a little, but not much. Because we change them to have all kinds of features we like. So think about the broccoli before, like you saw the wild Brassica oleracea. The inflorescence on that didn't look like it had much food value, right? But then when they get really dense and we get all those thick florets, now we got something substantial when we eat it. Well, that guy right there, under that fur, he's lean. He's like a deer. It's like venison. But not that one, because what we did was we figured out we could get it to accumulate real, like significant excesses of adipose tissue and intramuscular fat. And that's what we love about it. It's like when you bring up eating pig, it's like, where's your head go? It's like, bacon. So that's not natural to this guy. Think about him like your lettuce. If you just left your lettuce unattended, what will happen? It's going to get eaten by something. Imagine any of these domestic animals, like you just set them free out there. Like, oh, let's see how he does. Go, be free. It's like it becomes food for something really fast. Because what we give up in domestication are all of our defenses, because those are being managed for you. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a thing. What happens is we say to the animal, essentially, genetically, we say, we'll take care of your protection, we'll take care of you finding partners, we'll take care of where you sleep. In exchange, give up that nasty growl and those tusks, and we're not really liking any of that, and give that up, and you get to live a very easy life, but it always ends the same way, on a plate. It's not a fair chase. Now, we're headed into something weirder and slightly dystopian, and that's that our food's about to change again. So the Neolithic Revolution, where we went from eating wild foods to eating domesticated farmed foods, that started something in the arena of 12,000 years ago. Who's heard of the Neolithic Revolution, the farming revolution, right? We went from hunter-gatherers, we went from that to farmers. When we hear about it in studies, it's almost like it just happened overnight, like it was this big revolution, the whole world got together on it. That's not really how that happened. In fact, most places where people hunt and gather, the only way to get them onto farming has been conquest. Like most hunter-gatherers don't go, oh, farming looks like a better way. We'll give up our life way and we'll switch to that. That's not how that happened. Everybody knows what I mean. I don't need to go down that road, but you get how they get to farming. It's not like they wanted to. So when we talk about it as a revolution, it's almost the opposite. It was more of like an imperialistic kind of thing in many cases. But I also want to point out that the Neolithic Revolution is not complete. There are still about 100 tribes of people around the world hunting and gathering. So it's not like the Neolithic Revolution finished yet. We haven't even got everybody on board. I think that's important to remember because it's easy to think like this is just the life way now, and it's not. It's our life way. But we're heading into something different. We're going past processed food, past industrial food, and into biotech food. So this is all 3D printed food. It's made largely from insects and a few other things, the seeds of lupins, some algae. And the idea for this is that your insurance company will look at your profile and determine what food you should be eating, and you'll be given printer cartridges that can only print out food that your insurance company deems right for your body. So if you're overweight, your calories will be cut. If your blood pressure's high, your saturated fats will be cut. Does that make sense? And you would only be able to print food off of your cartridges. But everybody's food would be made out of the same stuff. So it's like top-down food planning that's underway. And the idea is just a handful of species that we can grow in big buildings like mealworms, for instance, very efficient, and there's a lot less pressure on our arable lands, but it does kind of take us further away from those creatures that we have always been in relationship with for our food. I think of eating as an incredibly intimate act because you take a creature and its body parts, and then you make your body parts out of that creature. That's pretty close connection. But it starts to get weird when you go through like a printer cartridge. Or who's seen the big push for the fake meats? That's 3D printed meat, plant-based. Pretty wild. I just watched a special on this. They've got this machine and there's a screen, and the guy can kind of toggle a dial, and it'll increase or decrease the amount of exterior fat or increase or decrease the marbling. So there's a big push towards this, plant-based meats. To me, that does not really look appetizing. But even more so, I don't know what it is. Whose body parts are those? I can't really tell. But what I know is we're becoming ecological aliens through this process. This 14,000-year process that's still unfolding. And when I say we're ecological aliens, let me kind of help you understand visually what I mean. So think about a hunter-gatherer in their natural life way on the land. Like this is a Khoisan person from South Africa. And when I think about what we look like when we go into nature, so think about you're going to go off for 3 days into nature. Like, that's every day in nature, not like a 3-day trip, right? That makes sense, everybody? This person lives in nature, but like we're going to go on a 3-day trip. Do we, when we go on a 3-day trip into nature, look more like a human being from Earth, or do we look more like an astronaut visiting from another planet? We start to approach planet Earth like it's another world. It's a hostile world. The big boots, the Gore-Tex pants, the Gore-Tex jacket. We've got to shield ourselves from the environment. The UV light, it could take out my eyes. I need my Oakleys. I got to have my helmet. And before you know it, you're carrying all the accoutrements of domestication into the natural world. Guilty of it too. We're acting like we live on another planet. My postulation is this: it's largely because of our diets. The further we get removed from the other living creatures of Earth, the less we start to see ourselves as living creatures from Earth. We're so busy talking about going to Mars. I think of it like somebody who leaves a bad relationship and jumps right into another bad relationship. It's like you trash Earth and then you just jump to another planet. We're going to be good up there, though. It's like, no, I think we need to figure it out here first before we jump into another relationship with another planet, because we haven't done so good with this one. So maybe we hold back a little bit and we reconnect here. And I think we do that through food. And in particular, I think we do it through meaningful connections with food. My wife and I, so that's my wife Ivani in the corner, say hi. We do a lot of foraging together. So I like to say we do everything from A to Z. So A, Acer, the genus of maple trees. We do that in the spring. And in the fall, Zizania. That's a canoe full of wild rice from right here in Maine. You guys know we have wild rice populations right here in the lakes of Maine? You go harvest enough grain for the year in a canoe in a day. Pretty amazing. But I just want to show you a few species from the coast here, because I think with you guys all being involved in the oceanic world, they'll be more relevant. So I just want to talk about a few connections that I've made. I didn't grow up hunting and fishing. I didn't grow up with this lifestyle. I arrived at this through doing all kinds of dietary experiments and asking myself that question, like, what's food? And it led me back to food. But not just the foods, to meeting the creatures. So that's harvesting soft-shell clams, Wolfneck Park. Man, I had no idea how they lived. I have no idea how they can be harvested the way they're harvested and still be there. It's incredible. They can't move. Frozen in the muds like that, just filtering seawater. It's incredible. I learned so much from them. Or like the humble mackerel, the Atlantic mackerel. Every time I bring up eating the mackerel, people will say the same stuff. It's kind of oily. They're pretty oily. Whenever I hear that, I'm like, bring it. Donuts are oily. Right? A lot of food we eat is oily. Man, I love mackerel. I find them all through the water column. They're like one of those foundational species to our fisheries. So I'll harvest them and I'll feed them back to striped bass, which is another fish I love to eat here in the summertime. Avani and I get out. And it's not like it's just about taking. I have to eat something. And wow, is it nice to meet them on their own terms in their own environment and understand this migration that they make, coming down from, Washington, D.C. area all the way up here, hanging out for the summer and heading back down. If I can get one for the year, I'm so stoked. And I know who that is that I'm eating when I sit down to the plate. or seeing species that are starting to come in like the black sea bass. Our waters are warming so fast, our fisheries changing. You probably know this, but the center of our lobster fishery is moving 2 kilometers a year north. But as that happens, it's being backfilled. Black sea bass are coming up, tog are coming up. And we've got new species, unregulated species, coming into our waters. Obviously, our lobster fishery, there's an old man right there. Going out to participate in that and seeing what that's really about and knowing what my food is. When I first saw a halibut, I thought about how many people go to restaurants and sit down to a piece of halibut and have no idea what it looks like. Who would be shocked if they saw what it looks like? Wait, both eyes are on the same side of its head? It's so strange. Like, I think about this often. Who's ever seen a lettuce plant grown to seed? For those of you who haven't, I bet you wouldn't recognize it as a lettuce when you see a mature lettuce plant. And that's weird because you've eaten lettuce your whole life. The first time I saw an asparagus plant growing out, who's seen that? It looks like a giant fern, kind of, with those pinnately compound leaves. First time I saw mature asparagus, I was like, oh, I've been eating this my whole life anonymously. That's kind of weird, right? To not know whose body parts you're eating. It's the first time. You're the first generation in history, essentially. You and your parents' generation, you're the first generation to not know what you're eating anymore. You don't go back 100 years, people were growing it or catching it or foraging it and processing it. That's why we have the term processed food. When you hear the term processed food, most of us just go, oh, that's bad food. No, no, no. When I get home with that, guess what I got ahead of me? A couple hours of work, processing. So processed food, man, you should see it with acorns. Avani and I make acorn flour. Acorns, by the way, think about the word acorn. A, like not, corn, a grain. Acorn's not a grain, but it's one of the oldest foods for humans. Really useful food to know. If you know acorns, you will never be able to starve to death. But they take a lot of processing. So you can imagine a generation that was like, wow, we can finally afford to have someone else process our food. And that's what we mean when we say processed foods. Someone else has processed it for you. Doesn't mean it's bad food. Right? Like if you cut the fillet out of that, it's processed. It's not bad. Industrialized food, that might be more what we mean. But my point being, I don't think many people would even recognize that as a food. Here's a real instructive one, the cod fishery, which we have collapsed over the course of 500 years. Anyone read the book Cod by Mark Kurlansky? That's like required reading, huh? That's a good book. Really understand what happened, but essentially how European people were even able to get here and set up here, it's because of the cod, the king of fisheries. Now basically a collapsed fishery. Backfilled by our pollock fishery. If anybody hasn't tried the pollock here in the state, wow, that's an awesome food. These fish, what you learn about the benthic region of the sea, you're fishing on the bottom. Or our Acadian reds, same thing, fishing on the bottom. That fish right there is probably older than me. So fascinating when you take a little time to learn about who you eat. Because some people might think, and you'll hear this commonly, because I hunt, I'll hear, well, how can you say you love these animals that you hunt? It's like, well, do you think a lion hates gazelles? I think a lion loves gazelles. In fact, the gazelles need the lion. The lion keeps the gazelles healthy. You've got to eat something. Hopefully what you eat brings you a connection to the place where you are. The squids here, man, found throughout our water column. The bluefin tuna, man, I spent a lot of time trying to get my hands on one of these. That was not easy. I fished 60 hours. I'm still eating that tuna. One tuna, I'm still eating it 2 years later. We'll be eating this swordfish for how long? 2 years probably? And I learned so much. I had no idea. Who's gone out past the Gulf Stream? Who's been out in the Gulf Stream? You're like, the water's purple. The boat's getting covered in salt crystals. What is this place? I would never have known that had I not gone on that quest to get access to that food, to that animal. That makes me, I believe, a better steward. It gives me ecological literacy. When it comes to plants in the world of foraging, when we talk about ecological literacy, we kind of have this joke, me and my friends, we say that most people driving down the road see a wall of green. Just a wall of green. Well, I met a guy recently, he didn't understand there was different kinds of trees. He just thought it was trees. Like they were all one species. I was like, you haven't noticed that some have leaves that turn color and fall off, and some have needles? Like, they're different. But people are ecologically illiterate because their diets have gotten so removed from ecology. So one of the things that happens is that wall of green turns into a wall of like friends. I'll give you an example. I make maple syrup, so I notice maple trees. Like you're driving down the road, you're like, oof, I'd tap that. I eat acorns, so I drive down the road and I go like, oaks. Like I see oaks. And a lot of the things I hunt eat oaks, so I see them. It's not just a wall of green. I see birch trees. We tap our birch trees and make birch syrup. And we harvest chaga mushrooms, Inanitas obliquus, off of the birch trees. So when I see them, it's like I pay attention. But I didn't start off that way. That came from my dietary relationship to the ecosystem. I'll give you one more example. Kids recently in a study in a school, elementary school kids, being asked to name animals. Guess what they name? African savanna animals. These are American kids. Lions, tigers. I guess that's not a savanna animal. Elephants, zebras. It's like, what about all the animals that live where you live? Well, they don't encounter them ever. And the ones that they did know, the study showed they had negative associations to. Raccoons, they're dangerous and dirty. Skunks, they spray you. So what we have now is a generation of kids who knows about animals from far away and is completely ignorant about what's close to them because they have no reason to interact anymore. I understand that 8 billion people can't start foraging and hunting, but some of us can maintain that old relationship. Here's why I think it matters. I don't think people protect what they don't really know about. I think there's a fallacy, and I think we'll see it play out. There's this thing now where you can buy carbon offset credits. I find that really bizarre. Like you can damage this piece of land if you take care of that piece of land. Well, how do you think I feel if I get my maitake mushrooms from this piece of land that you get to damage because you're going to take care of another place? Or how do you think it feels if a Walmart's going to come in and set down on top of a place you hunt? Or an oil rig's going to come on top of your favorite fishing spot? You start to become a caretaker and a steward of that place. You have a reason to protect that place. Those creatures become like family to you. What I think happens in nature for people is it's sort of like, imagine if you lived in your hometown, and when you took a walk down the sidewalk, everybody you saw was a friend or a relative. So you're walking down the street, hey Marty, hey Jim, hi Jane, how you doing? Everybody knows you, you know everybody. You feel like your network keeps you connected and safe. You're part of a place. Now imagine you move to a new town and you don't know anyone. And you step outside in the day and everything feels a little more alien and a little more threatening because you don't have any connections, meaningful connections. That's what it's like when we go into the woods. If we don't have those meaningful connections, the place is a little foreign, a little unsafe. You're probably a little less likely to speak up on behalf of that place because you don't have any reason to. And I think that's really important we maintain those connections. And I share all this because I feel like many of you are going to go on to become, you're going to work in the industries, you're going to maybe be policymakers at some point, you're going to be involved in the conversation around our fisheries and our seas. And I want you to remember what we did to the prairie. Because the grasslands of this country, which are now our bread belt, were mowed down and we took all the buffalo off of it so we could bring in cows. We took all of those prairie grasses off and we brought in wheat and barley. We replaced the wildlands with our domesticated suite of species. And now we look at it and realize there was a mistake. And we're quickly advancing into our seas now. And we're going to need to, for sure. We're going to need aquaculture. We're going to need these things. But we need to be careful to preserve our wild places too. And a lot of you are going to be stewards of those last wild places. Hey, lastly, my show, you can find it on Amazon Prime. My podcast, you can find everywhere. Again, I'm Daniel Vitalis on Instagram, and WildFed is wild.fed on Instagram as well. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. Now, can you hear me? I know that some people have another class, and that's okay if you need to leave, but we do have time for questions if people have questions they want to ask.
Hi.
Hi.
So, is this on?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I know earlier you discussed that you were vegan for about 10 years. I just wanted to ask, what made you change your mind about veganism?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because how I got there was asking this question, what's natural food for people? I kind of got bought into like a Garden of Eden type of story. Like we just lived in nature and ate fruits and stuff. It was so cool. And then I read a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which was a dentist in the early 1900s. He traveled the world at that time. People knew back then that mercury was toxic to people, and we called it quicksilver, like a living silver. And people who put it in people's mouths, in their teeth for fillings, were called quacks. Quacksilver, the German. So he was like, wait a second, why are we even getting holes in our teeth? Not how do you fill them, why are we getting holes in our teeth? He studied people all around the world and looked at their traditional diets, and he found within 3 generations of going onto a westernized diet that their perfectly aligned teeth with nice space between them all started to crowd and get cavities. I didn't even really understand anthropology at the time. And once I started to understand, like, there's really not, I used to speak for vegans all the time, and I would do this thing. I'd go, who in the room knows a vegan? Want to play this game real quick? Who in the room knows a vegan? Okay, everybody leave your hands up. Only leave your hands up if you know somebody who's been a vegan longer than 5 years. If not, put it down. Oh, well, what's happening? 10 years. Where's the hands? 15 years. 30 years. A full lifetime from birth. Okay, now watch this. A full lifetime from birth who meets another vegan full lifetime from birth, and they have children successfully for 3 generations. In other words, veganism is an experiment, which is fine because we should do experiments, but we shouldn't go around yelling at people saying the whole world needs to take on this experiment overnight right now, or else you're evil and murderers. Then I was like, wait a second, that's intense. Just do the experiment. So I did the experiment 10 years, which is longer than most, and I personally developed health issues from that. And most of the people that I knew that were the big speakers and authors, I would see them eating foods that weren't vegan. And so all of that left me pretty disillusioned. I feel the same way about the carnivore diet. It's like tick, tock, tick, tock. It's like somewhere in the middle. Because the real human diet, from my perspective, would be the omnivore diet. And that is not a sexy title with not a cool sounding book, you know? Oh, I point like I have the magical mic.
Hello.
Hi there.
I was wondering if you've ever read this book called Super Life by Darren O'Lean.
What's it called?
Super Life.
No, I have not.
It's this guy. He kind of sounds like you, sorta. He went around the world trying to figure out like what would be the perfect diet to live a long and healthy life, and he kind of talks about the veganism and vegetarianism and all these other different types of diets, and a lot of what he says is having a multiple diet that maybe has less sugar than what the American typical diet is now is just a bit better for everyone. But it's an interesting book, and your talk just reminded me of it.
One of the things that I think is really interesting is you have like built in, we all have biologically built in a mouth, like a response to sugar in our mouth or fat in our mouth, because those are hard to find in nature. So when you forage, after a little while, you're like, wait a second, where's the calories here? Like you can eat a lot of leaves, they don't have a lot of calories. When you find sugar or fat, your body lights up, you get the dopamine response. The problem is we still have that, and now we're swimming in fat and sugar. It's everywhere, and we still have the same response, which is eat more now because famine's coming. Except famine never comes, and we just keep eating and eating and eating. And I've heard it called nostalgia for the Pleistocene. It's like a remnant craving, which we have to learn how to control because it was for so long controlled by our environment, and now the environment no longer controls for it.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say awesome talk, super interesting. Why do you think humans have an easier time accepting that plants can be modified as opposed to animals? Like, what's the stigma behind that?
Yeah, I think it's speciesism. It becomes a really interesting question. Like, is the life of a gray whale worth more than the life of a mosquito? Like, it depends. Like, this is a philosophical thing. Like, does life work on a hierarchy? Because typically, people don't like that idea. You start being like, well, it's a hierarchy. Well, it's like, well, I don't like hierarchies. It's like, well, then stop killing mosquitoes and don't step on plants. So I think part of it's that, and then part of it is it just gets easier and easier as you go away from animals that look like you. So a lot of people who are vegan might say they don't like the idea of you eating a clam, but they're just trying to be internally consistent because the clam's hard to relate to, even though it's an animal, you know? I think the more it starts to look like us, the more intense it gets for us. And so I think it's probably empathy is ultimately why, because a lot harder to look at a deer and kill it than it is at like a lobster. It's just a lot easier. And then with plants, wow, it's like a whole nother level. And then fungi, algae, we don't even think about microbiota. Like, no one drinks a beer and goes like, I feel bad for all these Saccharomyces yeast that gave their life for me to have this beer. So I think the further we get away from ourselves, the easier it gets to just dissociate from it. You're welcome.
Thank you, Daniel. With that, we'll end our seminar. Thanks one more time to Daniel Vitalis for coming to talk.
And I'll hang out a bit if anybody has any more questions they want to ask.
Next week, we'll welcome Justin Stevens from the Maine Sea Grant Program. Thanks, everybody.